Are black holes conscious? What would a panpsychist science look like? And could a Buddhist accept my argument against physicalism? These are just some of the questions we'll be wrestling with in this month's Diary of a Philosopher. Okay, quick update on what I've been up to this month. In terms of the public work, I've been doing a lot of in-person interviews for this channel. So thus far, I've only done one in-person interview. It was a lovely interview with Anil Seth. Unfortunately, it fucked up a bit because the mics didn't turn on, so it was really rubbish recording. But this time, I think we've got it really sorted. We've done a lot more to put out. It's probably going to be actually more in-person than remote interviews, thanks to kind paid subscriber support. So I did an interview, I think the first one that's going out, with Tyler McNabb on Do Buddhists Believe in the Christian God? Might sound like a wacky claim, but Tyler's got a book, co-written book, defending this, amongst others. We had a lovely chat about that. With Mary Leng, I talked about whether numbers are real, philosophy of mathematics. At the end of our discussion, I raised the possibility that mathematical knowledge was grounded in mystical experiences. She was a little bit skeptical of that, but anyway, it was a nice discussion. With Martin O'Neill, we talked about politics, inequality. Is that a problem? If so, why? Martin is more, I guess, on the left of politics. I'd like to have a guest on the right of politics. But anyway, this was an interesting, something a bit different, something sort of a bit useful for a change. All this useless crap, don't we? Like, does consciousness exist? Because consciousness exists. My friend Keith Frankish might think otherwise, in a sense at least. So yeah, nice to talk about something a little bit useful. What were my other interviews on religious experience? Is it rational to trust religious experiences with Greg Stacey? Jack Symes. We did a sort of collaboration on both of our podcasts. Check out Jack's channel, Jack Symes Philosophy. He's recently come out as a pantheist, thinking that God and the universe are one and the same thing. He's moved from agnostic to pantheist, but he's someone like me who finds both the arguments for God and the arguments against God both quite persuasive, and he's sort of torn. So that was in Durham Castle. That was quite exciting. I think I'm going to try and film all my in-person interviews in Durham Castle, which I think would be quite exciting. So the first few are not that way, but I just had the idea. So with Jack, it was in Durham Castle, and then I was supposed to do on William Lane Craig on his big recent tour to the UK. We had a little panel discussion with Jessica Fraser and Joe Foley in London, and then he was going to come to Durham. I was going to show him him and his wife Jan the sights. I had it all mapped up. We were going to go to the cathedral, walk around the river, but then he took ill, unfortunately, had really bad, did his throat in, really bad flu and stuff, so he couldn't come to the Durham bit. We're hopefully going to have a remote interview in the near future. He's up for that. So, but we got a last minute excellent replacement in the form of David Wilkinson, who is a trained astrophysicist and a religious believer. He is a lovely person and a really interesting thinker. So in Durham Castle, we had an audience and we had a lovely conversation. A lot of our students here at Durham. David Wilkinson, you might have heard him if you're a UK listener to Radio 4. If you're a bit old school, not just YouTube podcasts, listening to Radio 4, is it 8 a.m. every morning? They have Thought for the Day, where someone of faith from they go through all the different religions, shares some contemplative spiritual wisdom for the day. I used to love Thought for the Day. I've sort of drifted away from it somehow. All this bloody YouTube, that's the problem. Anyway, David Wilkinson is often a contributor to share some wise spiritual words for the day on Thought for the Day. He's got a lovely voice. I think some of our students are maybe a bit disappointed that there wasn't more controversy between us. I think, I'm not that far away from conventional Christianity, just a heretical twist, I think. I And we stayed in the castle talking to the students in the castle bar for hours afterwards. Absolutely lovely. Religious people, atheists. I think people found it really fascinating. You enjoy that. So anyway, they're all recorded. Gonna go out in the near future, so subscribe. Lots of things booked in. Rowan Williams, David Chalmers to celebrate 30 years of his classic, The Conscious Mind. Sean Carroll. We need to get more people on I disagree with. Lots to debate with Sean. We've got about 10 hours of debates online already. Check them out. But we're going to have another one. Loads and loads of stuff. Can't think. Now, Liz Jackson. This is the first week I haven't had a podcast. It's just been lovely, actually. This is the only thing I'm doing. It's the only time I'm talking to a camera. Just been doing my writing, hanging out with my kids. Been really nice. Yes. So, well, moving, nice segue there to academic stuff. So as I said in my last episode of this, I've been doing a lot of collaborations. I talked about some of them last week. One I missed out is I'm collaborating with Jonathan Emery. Exploring, well, I've talked about this a little bit on a few podcasts. A potential experimental way forward for the science of consciousness. Science of consciousness, some wonderful stuff, but there is zero consensus. There's just, it's hard to find how we're getting consensus. And there's a lot of papers coming out pointing to why, identifying assumptions, why we're failing to make progress. Maybe because philosophical assumptions are built into how people are evaluating the evidence. So not just the big questions, where does consciousness come from, the hard problem and so on, but just where the hell is consciousness in the brain? Philosophical assumptions getting in there. Matthias Michel writes some great stuff on this. I might get him on, actually. He was on Mind Chat a long time ago. Might get him back on. But we had Tom McClelland on Mind Chat. Me and Keith Frankish did a Mind Chat on... Tom has a great recent paper arguing for permanent agnosticism on whether AI is conscious or will be conscious, because it's hard to see how you can experimentally settle whether consciousness is biological or computational. Here's a possible way forward. Me and Jonathan are exploring. Looking for evidence of strong emergence in the neural correlates of consciousness. Strong emergence, bit of philosophical jargon there, meaning new fundamental causal principles at higher levels of complexity. Not a very fashionable view, something I've debated with Sean Carroll a lot. So it would be things that if you were just working with the basic equations of physics, like Schrödinger equation, you'd be surprised. Things would happen at higher levels of complexity that you would not expect if you're just working with those principles. Not very fashionable. It's a coherent possibility. Well, Sean Carroll has, argued against me in a collection, a volume called Is Consciousness Everywhere? People might be interested in, which is responses to my work on panpsychism. Sean's got one arguing that there's no room in physics. So different ways you can justify this kind of reductionist story where it's, basic physics runs the show. And he says there's no room in physics. Well, I examined Jonathan Emery's PhD recently, and he was looking at cutting-edge physics, including what Sean's written, cutting-edge neuroscience, identifying where there is scope in physics, for example, for fundamental mental forces. So he's a substance dualist. He believes in the soul or the immaterial mind. That's not my position, but I am open to non-reductionist forms of panpsychism, where consciousness is the intrinsic nature of the physical. It's not some extra soul thing. But when it emerges at the biological level, it brings with it radically new causal dynamics. So how could this help us with the science of consciousness? Well, look, we're failing to get consensus. For example, is it computational? Is it biological? Is it global workspace? Is it integrated information theory? Is it higher order thought? What if one of these candidates for the physical correlates of consciousness had strong emergence, had new causal dynamics, and we could just identify that empirically? I think that would be pretty bloody strong evidence that that is the correct correlate, that is the correct correlate of consciousness. I think that'd be so exciting if we, I mean, that would in a way settle some serious philosophical questions empirically. So I've been thinking about this for a long time, but I'm not an experimental scientist myself. You know, how feasible is this? Jonathan's got some ideas. He's an excellent, really imaginative, wonderful, rigorous, scientifically informed thinker. Got some thoughts about maybe AI could help us through sort of artificially setting up some of these, the structures that are alleged to correlate with consciousness. We're still talking it through, working out the details, but some fascinating ideas here. So I'm just absolutely loving working with people with different skills, different ideas to write together. And, you know, it means you can get more done because you can sort of work on different things at once. The only downside, I'm starting to realize I am a bit of a control freak, you know. So I got, when I get the, you know, if someone else writes the first draft, I'm like, because I hate writing the first draft. I like going over, but then I get the first draft and it's like, that's not exactly what I would write. I think I am a bit, the way my neurodiverse brain works, I'm either kind of completely inattentive and can't concentrate, or I'm totally obsessive. And I go through that sort of spectrum every week. Okay. Yes, I zoomed into a really good consciousness conference at Lugano last week in Italy, and really, really wonderful mix of perspectives. Ralph Weir, who I'm collaborating with, he's a substance dualist. So he did a talk, but there are also many kind of physicalist, very scientific philosophers and scientists, and we had some debate there. And so my talk was again returning to the toad venom experience I've been going on and on about recently, digging more in. So you might have seen on the channel my public lecture at Liverpool on, is it rational for me to trust that experience, how things seem to be. This Lugano talk was digging a bit deeper than that, going through different theories of justification, because we shouldn't just be working. We need to set aside our biases. Oh, it's obviously a hallucination, and just look at different theories of justification. That's another bit of philosophical jargon, I suppose, for what makes a belief rational. Right? What we think some things it's okay. Some things it's rational to believe. Maybe some things you should believe if the evidence is overwhelming. Some things it's irrational to believe. I think it's irrational to believe the moon is made of cheese. So what makes a belief rational or not? I think some people have this crude idea. Well, it's because science has showed it's true. It's a true scientific fact. And I just think, of course, science is absolutely crucial, and experimental data is really important for an important part of what it's rational to believe. But a very crude scientific model can't explain, for example, how we avoid external world skepticism, or the diversity of forms of justified belief, from the mathematical to the empirical, to knowledge of your own consciousness. So anyway, I got a bit deeper into that, and actually I threw in a couple of slides that I was sort of towards the end of the day, and I was watching other people's talks, and there were these kind of very scientific physicalist talks, and I thought, I need to give my perspective on the problem of consciousness. So I did a couple of slides on that as well. Anyway, I've got a recording of that. That will go up at some point. Probably it's already up by the time this goes out, so you can check that out. Yeah, I'm just getting loads of public and academic work done. I mean, I'm lucky at the moment. I'm on research leave funded by the Beliefless Spirituality Project, a really good project, Templeton project, based at John Templeton Foundation is a funding body, by the way. And this project's based at the University of Sheffield, exploring ways of engaging religion without belief. right? So that doesn't necessarily mean you think it's not true, you disbelieve. It might be you hope it's true, you trust it's true, you commit to its truth, something like that. Okay, this is something I'm going to be writing on. When I have Liz Jackson on the channel in the near future, we're going to be talking about this. Can an atheist go to church, or an agnostic? Okay, right. Is that everything you want to know about me? I need to get more people on I disagree with, right? Okay, let's move on to these questions. As usual, paid subscribers get priority. If you're a paid subscriber, thank you so much. I don't know how I'm going to keep all this going when I go back to full-time teaching in October. Hopefully now, if I can, get the foundation solid, I can carry on doing this. But I really need support from someone editing the videos. Now we're doing more in-person ones, filming them. So I really can't do this without people's support. Thank you very much. And the small thank you for that is you definitely get your questions answered in this monthly Ask Me Anything, I guess. And also the other guarantee, I suppose, is I will definitely respond to your comments underneath my Substack articles at least once, and at least if they're not really long, if it's kind of really long. So it sounds terrible making those constraints, but I'm doing the best I can to fit in academic work, public work, young children. So that's my way of thanking kind supporters. Okay, so Edward Dodge has a question this week. Thank you for your support, Edward. Philip, have you compared Panpsychism to the Shiva Shakti principles in Hinduism and the idea that the cosmos is made of mind and matter, both coexistent and eternal? Just as you have a mind and body, so too does the entire cosmos, which means the cosmos is a dyad rather than a monad. I think this model fits Panpsychism perfectly, or alternatively, Panpsychism confirms Shiva Shakti. Interesting question. It's not something I'm an expert in. My understanding of Shiva Shakti is that pure impersonal consciousness and sort of dynamic energy are kind of the same thing, two sides of the same coin. I suppose you can see a sort of analog here with the Bertrand Russell inspired panpsychism I defend. So Russellian panpsychism, as it's called, the idea is that physics just tells us what stuff does. Pretty uncontroversial, sometimes called structural realism. But consciousness is what stuff is, right? So all there is for the panpsychist is consciousness. Simple forms of consciousness at the base of reality, more complex forms of consciousness at higher levels of complexity, perhaps. But all there is consciousness. So what are these physicists talking about when they're talking about particles or fields? They are talking about the most rudimentary forms of consciousness in terms of what they do. They've got simple, predictable behavior, and physicists come up with equations to map out that behavior. Now, physicists don't know that's what they're doing. But that's just because physicists aren't interested in what matter is. They're just interested in what it does. So, yeah, in a way, these are two sides of the same coin. The other thing it made me think of, actually, is a couple of things has prompted, actually. The powerful qualities view, which is something that's discussed a lot in academic philosophy. Actually, most associated with my colleague, John Heil, who's with us here in Durham for one term every year. It's just the idea that there's a sort of identity. C.B. Martin, I guess, was the originator. A sort of identity between, well, there's this classic philosophical distinction between categorical properties and dispositional properties. So dispositional properties are sort of doing properties. Categorical properties are being properties. And the powerful qualities view says that they're just the same thing. There's sort of identity. Now, I've always not been totally on board with this view because there does seem to me at least a conceptual distinction, at least if we're thinking of ordinary consciousness. There seems to me at least a conceptual distinction between how pain feels and what pain does. It's tricky because it's so obvious and intuitive that pain causes avoidance. But focus your attention on the question. I'm asking, is there a logical connection? Is it a contradiction to talk of something that feels like pain that causes attraction rather than avoidance? I don't think there's a contradiction there. So we've got at least a conceptual distinction. However, that's ordinary consciousness. I mean, another way of putting it is epiphenomenalism seems logically coherent. So epiphenomenalism is the view that consciousness doesn't do anything. Maybe it's brought into existence by the brain, but it just sort of floats there, like the steam coming off a train sort of doesn't impact back on the train. Some philosophers have this view. I'm blanking on name now of good philosopher who has this view. Robinson. So I don't think epiphenomenalism is true, but it's not contradictory, right? Okay, but that's ordinary consciousness. Now, people are going to be getting bored of me coming back to my toad venom experience, but that experience in which pure consciousness was witnessed, this Shiva Shakti stuff did seem more. I mean, it's the classic thing that resonated in this experience is the radical non-duality. The radical lack of any sort of division. Well, my Substack post this month was hammering into drawing out the implications of this radical non-duality. Whether it means we end up with something that's not a contingent entity, that's in some sense beyond being and non-being. But let's try not to ramble, Goff. But yes, with this pure consciousness, the distinction between is this being or doing did seem to collapse. I just didn't. My breakthrough making more sense of this experience. I mean, it's just so undescribable in every way. So what I've been doing is just drawing out the implications of the fact that it is indescribable, that our normal categories don't apply to it. So yeah. So yes. So I wouldn't say that Shiva Shakti stuff seems true to me of ordinary consciousness. There's at least a conceptual distinction between what it is and what it does, but maybe of this pure consciousness. Now there's the question, what's the connect? Is pure consciousness the only thing that exists? I still find that hard to believe. I want to take seriously the reality that seemed to be presented in my recent psychedelic experience, but also the reality that seems to be presented in ordinary experience, that there's a mobile phone here, that there is differentiation. Okay. Anyway, thanks for your question, Edward. Made me think. Okay, Ryan Hamill, thank you for your support. Thought experiment. How would the claim that the universe is a process of serial becoming rather than parallel help or hurt your beliefs in panpsychism? For micropsychists, the obvious one to me is that it dissolves some forms of the combination problem, subject and arguably structural, in micropsychism. For a cosmopsychist like yourself, I am less sure, just curious of your thoughts. Now here, Ryan, I'm intrigued by the question, but I just think I want to know more, I suppose, of what you're meaning by serial becoming. I'm just a bit stuck on, maybe this is my ignorance, I'm just a bit stuck on what you mean by that. I'm intrigued about how this can connect to micropsychism or cosmopsychism. Got another question coming up on micropsychism, cosmopsychism. But, well, maybe you could just shed light on that and I can respond in next month's AMA. But sorry about that. I'm just not sure exactly what you're meaning by process of serial becoming. So we'll have to come back to that, I think. Sorry. Okay. Next question by Richard Dorset. What would a panpsychist science look like? So look, I think there's an important distinction between the science and the philosophy of consciousness. I think of the scientific task of consciousness as about correlations, broadly speaking, which kinds of brain activity or physical activity go along with conscious experience. And as we've already discussed this, there is no consensus, sadly, but I'm enthusiastic about trying to pursue this scientifically. I say correlations. I mean, there's a bit of nuance, as came up in my chat with Anil Seth. I mean, the more systematic it gets, it starts to become explanatory. But still, I do think it remains at the level of correlation, ultimately, until you bring in the philosophical part of the science of consciousness. That sounds... I'm trying to set up science in opposition to philosophy. The philosophical part of research into consciousness, which is answering the question, well, why is consciousness in the physical world correlated? Is it because physicalism is true? Is it because dualism is true? Is it because panpsychism is true? Mysterianism? Whatever. So these are, broadly speaking, separate activities. And, so for example, Anil Seth and I very much disagree on physicalism versus panpsychism, on the philosophy there, but I think we're quite closely aligned on more empirical stuff, more of the scientific stuff, like is consciousness biological or computational? I think we're both on the biological side. Whereas David Chalmers, conversely, is more on my side with the philosophy. He's more associated with a form of dualism, but he's sympathetic to panpsychism, open to panpsychism. But he's more on the computational side of the scientific question of his consciousness, computational or biological. So that's more the correlation question, Where do we find consciousness in the physical world? With computational processes or biology? Or something else altogether? So I don't think it's like, oh, there's a panpsychist science. But, I mean, one thought I've had as to how we can begin to make progress, just as it does, I want to talk about this more and more. It does seem to be coming out that how we're doing the science is impacted by one's philosophical assumptions. So maybe we need to temporarily fragment the field into sort of philosophy science communities, research programs that are doing experiments with philosophical assumptions, fixing how you set up the experiments, how you interpret results, and so on, and just see what bears fruit. I mean, I suppose IIT, Integrated Information Theory, comes close to this. There's close connections between scientists working on Integrated Information Theory and philosophers working on Panpsychism. They're not the same thing, but they are closely connected. Hette Hasselmerk has taken IIT and interpreted it in terms of Bertrand Russell panpsychism. Giulio Tononi, the founder of IIT, has some philosophy in the foundations of how he sets things up. I suppose I would just like to see it done more systematic. I just think we're not, as a society, at the stage where we fully understand the need for philosophy, right? Especially when it comes to these areas where the rules of the game are not fixed. And there is a philosophy behind science. The philosophy we've been operating with for the past 400 years is from Galileo, that was explicitly designed to exclude consciousness. I think we need another philosophy if we want to bring consciousness back into science. So we're not at that point where we realize that it's inevitably a philosophical and a scientific task, and we need the two working together. But there are ways in which they interact. I mean, I talk in the Why book about how they might interact, how one's philosophical assumptions might impact the science. But I guess I don't see it as like a panpsychist science. Maybe more an anti-physicalist research program, or a strong emergentist research program, right? So we need to be, maybe. I just don't want to be so binary as, oh, we're doing panpsychist science. That's too simplistic. But we need to be taking the philosophy more seriously and setting up experimental research programs rooted in very specific philosophical assumptions. Hope that answers the question in an informative way, how I'm thinking about these things. Okay, Tim Sarek. Following the route of Mereological nihilism, what counts as a conscious part of nature? Where does a mind begin and end? And on what basis are those boundaries drawn? So Mereological nihilism, for those who don't know, is the view that there are no composite entities. There are only fundamental particles, I guess. Or you could have a monistic view where there's only the whole universe. Let's put that on one side for the sake of simplicity. I mean, I'm not sure I am a Mereological nihilist, for one thing, Tim. That's a sort of very reductionist picture. So the Mereological nihilist would say, you know, there aren't really tables. There are just particles arranged table-wise. There aren't really cups. There are just particles arranged cup-wise. There aren't really human minds. There are just particles arranged mind-wise in the brain. I mean, one of the most influential exponents of Mereological nihilism, Ted Sider, in his paper Against Parthood, very long, complicated, techie paper, very challenging paper, probably not that accessible if you don't have a philosophy PhD. But he spends less than a page on what he calls the Cartesian objection, that, you know, the conscious mind is not, it exists for one and isn't a particle. And that to my mind is the biggest objection, right? I've got a paper. There is more than one thing arguing this, and in a number of places argue that, you know, Mereological nihilism runs into trouble with consciousness. My conscious mind exists. I have Cartesian, something close to certainty, as Descartes observed, that I think, therefore I am. There is this composite object. So Ted Sider spends less than a page and says, okay, well, there are sort of true sentences that I exist, but they're just made true by particles. No! I exist, God damn it! I give a bit more of an argument, you know. So I guess I'm not sympathetic to Mereological nihilism, I'm afraid. But there's still a good question about where does the mind begin and end. I mean, we're stuck with these scientific, the science of consciousness, that these struggles that I'm wrestling with, that I'm thinking about, that I want to interview people about, and as well as doing academic work with, how we start to get consensus on this. I mean, one philosophical view I hold, again, that might help us make progress on the science of consciousness, is that consciousness can't be vague. It can be vague whether or not somebody is rich or poor. You know, it's a borderline. Whether or not someone's young or old. Whether or not someone's hungry or not hungry. I don't think it can be vague whether or not something has feelings. Whether or not there's something that it's like to be a given organism. So Eric Schwitzgebel, very good philosopher, disagrees with me on this. He's got a wonderful paper saying it could be, for example, no fact of the matter as to whether or not a snail is conscious or not. You know, it's like someone who's neither rich nor poor is in that grey area. I think that makes no sense. And if that's true, it's an important, as I talk about this in the Why book, which is behind one of my shoulders, that's an important constraint on a theory of consciousness, because not all of the candidates for the neural correlates of consciousness is compatible with that. Integrated information theory is, because there's sort of an exact, mathematically precise point at which consciousness turns on and off when you've got more integrated information in the whole and the parts. But with global workspace, it's about when the information is sort of broadcast enough, fame in the brain, as Dan Dennett called it. There's going to be borderline cases where is it broadcast quite enough, not quite enough? So there are going to be, that could be the case with the snail. So this is what I'm trying to do, I suppose, is pin down how philosophical assumptions could help us make progress with the science of consciousness, and maybe get experimental programs going on that basis. Okay, a little bit tired today. My 6-year-old was up in the night. I was lying with her for an hour, and then I was reading philosophy, and then I couldn't stop thinking about philosophy for another hour. So excuse me if I'm a little bit tired. Hansara Gunaratna, apologies for stumbling with that. Thoughts on scientific anti-realism? If not, what arguments convince you of scientific realism? Cool question. Not something I've done a lot of work on. I guess I'm sympathetic to the mainstream view, structural realism, that science reveals the structure of the world, the causal mathematical structure of the world. Now, this goes into two camps, ontic and epistemic. So ontic structural realism, associated among others by James Ladyman, who I debated at one point. I should try and have a chat with James Ladyman, that'd be cool. Someone I disagree with. I need more people I disagree with. So ontic structural realism says there is just the structure. That's all there is. Well, my colleague Stephen Mumford holds that in a sense, if we're bringing in causation as well. Not just pure mathematical structure. Whereas epistemic structural realism, I would go for more that science just reveals, that's all science reveals. That doesn't mean that's all there is. Of course, as a panpsychist, I then say, aha, there's a place for consciousness. There's a hole in our scientific story. We can put consciousness in there. Consciousness is what realizes that structure. So if, like, you think of the structure of physics as sort of the software, consciousness is the hardware on which that structure is implemented. You could look at the mind chat, actually, you had with Kat Gillen on scientific realism, where we discussed some of these issues. And I mean, this is the response to the pessimistic meta-induction. How do we make sense as a scientific realist? So scientific realist, I should have said this to start off with, is one popular way the realist responds to the pessimistic meta-induction, which is, in a sense, the track record of science rejecting theories, as one theory and it goes for another. And then you think, well, that's going to go on. And so you think, well, I shouldn't trust the theories it's telling us right now. Okay, I'm probably sometimes I've thought about this stuff. I'm probably not giving the argument exactly as a philosopher of science would give it, but that's the rough idea. But the response is, well, what science is getting right is the structure. And so it's not that Newton's theory was wrong. Newton's theory got something right about structure, and then Einstein's theory of gravity got more fine-grained structural details. So we as realists, we can say, yeah, science is getting us at getting the truth of reality, and it's a story of progress, of delving deeper into that structure. I mean, I must admit, I haven't looked too much at the arguments for anti-realism. Maybe I should get an anti-realist on the channel to debate them. It's just not something I've looked that much into. I suppose I'm quite old-fashioned, really, with my metaphysics in some ways, which might annoy some panpsychists, really. I'm sort of very kind of Western, objective, realist. Maybe some panpsychists want me to be a bit more postmodern, a bit more kind of anti-realist, open to more flexible interpretations of reality. I'm a bit boring, really. Never mind. Okay. Lacan Can asks, does consciousness disappear in a black hole? Or are black holes conscious? Very, very cool question, Lacan Can. Thank you so much. Do you know, this is not something I've ever thought about, not something that ever crossed my mind. You think it would as a panpsychist, sort of obvious thing to think about. But now I do think about it, I suppose the question has to be yes. A black hole is not nothing, right? In fact, I'm attracted to a view known as supersubstantivalism, which is that so substantivalism is the view that space or space-time is an entity, as opposed to Leibniz's view that the relationalist view that it's just about space is just about the relationships between physical objects like particles, for example. So Newton and Leibniz sort of thing they debated, or proponents of their views debated. There are still relationalists in the contemporary age, although I suppose it does seem substantivalism fits better with Einsteinian general relativity. But so supersubstantivalism is that space-time is an entity, and it's the only entity. It's the only entity. So material objects are just regions of space-time. Regions of space-time with certain properties, like mass, for example. Very good, interesting defense by Jonathan Schaffer of supersubstantivalism in his paper. What's it called? Space-time, the one substance. I think he says they're just material objects are regions of space-time that properties are pinned onto. So there's no sort of bearer of the properties. They're just the properties are pinned onto the region of space-time. He's famous for defending what he calls priority monism, that the whole of the universe or the whole of space-time is the one fundamental object. So it's a sort of radically top-down view. So I suppose, what is a black hole? Or I'm open to physicists correcting me on this, but my understanding is it's a sort of very highly warped region of space-time. And as a panpsychist, I think consciousness is the intrinsic nature of matter, is the intrinsic nature of physical reality, of space-time if you're a supersubstantivalist. I think a black hole is going to have a very, very intense, perhaps infinitely intense form of consciousness. A radically unusual form of consciousness. Do I want to say that? What am I talking about, actually? I'm thinking this out loud. I mean, I suppose insofar as I am thinking that the whole of space-time is conscious, but not all regions of space-time are conscious. So I don't think this table is conscious, for example. So actually, I take it back. I think there is consciousness underlying the space-time of which the black hole is a region, but whether the black hole has its own consciousness separated out from that, I think we're just back to this empirical question of which things are conscious that we have no consensus on, that a lot of this discussion's been about. My friend Rupert Sheldrake, don't agree with all Rupert's views, but he's an interesting thinker. He has a paper that I commented on arguing that stars are conscious. I don't think we've got enough evidence to say that. I mean, look, the problem is consciousness is not publicly observable. That's why we're in this mess, because all you can do is sort of start with the human case where you can ask someone, are you feeling something when your brain's in this state? And try and extrapolate from there. And the further you get from the human situation, the harder it is. So black holes are pretty far from the human condition. So yeah, I don't know. It's a cool question. If they are conscious, then it's going to be a very intense, indescribable form of consciousness. So in summary, there is consciousness underlying the structure, the bit of space-time that is the black hole. Whether it has its own unified consciousness separated out from the rest of the universe, fuck knows. I don't know. We need to make more progress in science of consciousness. Well, maybe if we can get off the ground the unfashionable proposal I'm making of an empirical attempt to discover whether any of the candidates for the neurocorrelates of consciousness embody strong emergence, maybe that would give us concrete empirical support for a certain view of the neurocorrelates of consciousness, and we can apply that over to black holes, perhaps. What would integrated information theory say about whether black holes have consciousness? Write it in the comments under the video. I'll have to think that through. Okay, I'm going to have to speed up. I always take too long again. I enjoy this too much. All Good Things says, do you think there's more promise for panpsychism solving the combination problem, or cosmopsychism solving the decoupling problem? That's usually called, I think, the decombination problem. So yeah, so the problem for micropsychism, the little things consciousness, how do they come together to make big consciousness? The problem for cosmopsychism, you start with the whole conscious universe. How do you get conscious parts? It depends which combination problem you're talking about. I think if it's just the sort of most forms of the combination problem, I think you'll get the same result. I mean, it's sort of, I've pressed in the academic literature a sort of conceivability argument, a conceivability worry for micropsychism, that you can conceive of a sort of panpsychist zombie where all its particles are conscious, but it's not conscious. David Chalmers has built on this and pointed out that likewise you could conceive of a conscious universe, but no regions of it are conscious. But there are other issues related to the combination problem where I think cosmopsychism does better. I think it opens up different models of reduction, maybe. I've argued, you can check out my paper, what's it called? So it'll be on my website, Cosmopsychism, Micropsychism, and the Grounding Relation, I think. That I think the model, I have a very detailed account in my academic book, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, and in this paper, of a kind of story of reduction at the micro level that involves some kind of analysis. I've got a very nuanced view of that, but it has to be sort of, in some sense, the essence has to open itself up to reduction. I like to give the example of parties. What is it for there to be a party? It's for people to be dancing and drinking stuff. That's sort of the essence of a party. Once you analyze it, opens itself up to reduction. And I don't think the essence of a subject, what it is to be a subjective experience, opens itself up to reduction in that way. So that's a problem for micropsychism. But I think cosmopsychism offers perhaps other models of reduction that, it's a long time since I've thought of this. Maybe the mind could be reducible to the universe in the sense that it's an aspect of a more expansive whole. So that's a very different kind of reduction that maybe looks more plausible in the case of consciousness. Okay, so that's one possibility. I'll have to speed up a little bit. Ulyss Navalus, I'll enjoy your engagement all the time. I'm sorry if I keep mispronouncing your name. Let me know if I'm mispronouncing it. Regarding revelation and the transparency argument, if someone is skeptical of essences, perhaps they adopt the Buddhist view of emptiness, for example, sunyata. Is there a way to frame or reconstruct your argument without reference to essences? Excellent question. So look, this is an important part, something I'm talking about a lot, something that's really part of my academic work, that's, if I may say, been influential in how people think about the problem of consciousness and why it's a particular problem for physicalism. The contrast, for example, with how David Chalmers thinks about it. I think we know what consciousness is. We know the essence of our conscious states, to a large extent at least. Now, it might seem I'm using something, what is this mysterious notion of essence? All I mean is what it is for something to have the property. For something to be spherical is for all points on its surface to be equidistant from its center. For something to be a triangle is for it to have three sides. I just think it's understanding what it is for something to have a property. So I don't think it is a kind of mysterious notion. So I think it's compatible with many Buddhist notions of essence where there's no kind of continuity over time or no sort of platonic timeless essences. Shamik Dasgupta, a very good philosopher who's exploring very radical views Buddhist views where there's no way of carving up reality. Ted Sider, who we mentioned earlier, his book Writing the Book of the World, has cool, very rigorous analytic tools for making sense of these kinds of views, where you've just got a sort of sentential operator which allows you to talk about metaphysical views that don't involve even entities. I've been thinking about this in relation to the toad venom stuff. I'll talk more about that in future. I'll have to leave it there for now, but I hope my notion of essence is flexible enough to allow for these more Buddhist views that are more cooler than my kind of boring old-fashioned Western metaphysics that I was talking about earlier. Corey Thaxton asks, what are the falsification conditions of your consciousness theory? As in, what kind of evidence would overturn it? And there is a thumbs up for this question. Okay, I get this question a lot. I will give the answer I give a lot. I would say not every question is an experimental question. Let me give you an example. A question I've been thinking about a lot recently. What makes a belief rational? Some beliefs are rational, some beliefs are irrational. What makes it rational or irrational to believe something? And you might think, oh, well, it's obvious, it's following the evidence. Okay, but what about mathematical beliefs? What makes them rational or irrational? Do we talk about evidence in that case? Or beliefs about your own conscious experiences? Or beliefs, what makes it rational to trust your memory? What makes it rational to assume we're not in the matrix? So, these are very deep and difficult questions about the nature of rationality. What makes a belief rational or irrational? Answering that question is not an experimental matter. We're not going to have scientists saying, oh, we've done an experiment to prove what makes a belief rational. It's not that kind of a question. And it's a matter of philosophical dispute which questions are or are not experimental questions. Sam Harris famously says, all ethical questions are scientific questions. I don't think anyone other than Sam Harris thinks that. But, he can make that claim. We can debate it. So what about the problem of consciousness? Is that all experimental or not? Well, I think in the case of consciousness, it's a mix. There are certainly some things we need experimental science to make progress on, particularly correlational questions like we've been talking about. Which kinds of brain activity go along with consciousness and which don't. Again, as we've been talking about, there's a deep problem that we're not getting consensus on that. But clearly, in some sense, that's experimental or deeply involves experimental work. But I think there's another central explanatory question in consciousness research which is not experimental. Okay, so let me try and make that clear by just saying this is something I'm talking more explicitly about recently, how I understand the problem of consciousness. I think to a significant extent, we grasp the essential nature of our conscious states by having them. We grasp the essential nature from the inside, as it were. I think that's kind of self-evident when you think carefully, because a feeling is essentially defined by how it feels. A feeling just is a way of feeling. Just as being a triangle is essentially defined by having three sides. That's just what a triangle is. It's a three-sided figure. That's what a feeling is. It's just a way of feeling. And so to the extent that for a particular, let's say a particular toothache you're having, to the extent that you know how it feels, you know what that feeling essentially consists in, what it is to feel that way. Note the nuance there that allows we can make all sorts of mistakes about our conscious experience, that we can get things wrong, that we can lack cognitive access to all the details. What I said was to the extent that we know how our conscious experiences feel or what it's like to have them, to that extent We grasp their essential nature. We know what it is to feel that way, to experience that way. So in the light of that, here's the unique issue with the problem of consciousness. We have significant information about what it is, independently of science, just by being conscious. We also have significant information, obviously, about the brain through physical science, through neuroscience. And the central challenge, or one central challenge, is how we fit together those two things we know about reality in very different ways. I mean, our conscious experiences are part, I mean, they're sort of subjective in a sense, but they're part of reality. My pain is part of reality. So that's a bit of reality I know directly. And then there's what we know about the brain through science. How do we fit together those two different ways of knowing about reality? And, you know, the Panpsychist has one answer, the Physicalist has another, the Dualist has another, the Mysterian has another, the Neutral Monist has another. And it's just not an experimental question. Experiments may bear on it, but it's not an experimental question. It's a philosophical question. Which of those is right? So no, there are no falsification conditions for my panpsychist view of consciousness. It's not that kind of question, just as there's no falsification conditions for the mainstream physicalist view. There's no falsification conditions for, you know, what is it for a belief to be rational? Or what's the foundational framework in moral philosophy? These are just not experimental questions. That's what I would say. I'm sure it's not going to satisfy me. I mean, I can see the frustration, you know. It would be nice if we could. What's the experiment to settle this? I feel that must be particularly frustrating if you are an experimental scientist and you're used to sort of working hard to get kind of tangible results. You know, some questions are experimental. Does smoking cause cancer? Right? But unfortunately, not all questions can be answered in that way. And it's frustrating, but that's just the nature of the human epistemological situation. Let me know what you think of that, Corey. Okay, very quick last question. Do you have any plans on writing or speaking more about political philosophy? And more specifically, Georgism? I've so far... So Georgism, for people who don't know about it, is the sort of left-wing version of libertarianism. Where right-wing libertarianism falls short, I think, in a very obvious way, you could see my debate with Mike Humer, is when it comes to land or natural resources. Like, who has a moral right on those? So Georgists say, well, we share out all the land and natural resources, and then we're libertarians about what you do with your own labour. Singapore, by the way, very capitalist country, but the land is owned by the state, and you sort of lease it out on a sort of lifetime basis. I'm not sure. I mean, I've written a lot about that, just sort of popularizing academic work. I'm not sure I've got anything original to say of my own, but check out my interview with Martin O'Neill, and you know that has spurred me to think about more things. This is what I'm interested in at the moment is. I mean, that's very kind of complex, abstract stuff I used to popularize, but I think like what I would want to focus on discussions, for example, around the work of Thomas Piketty and who's the other French economist who's doing a lot of podcasts at the moment for his new book on we should tax billionaires, Gabriel Zucman, just pointing out that most people pay 40 or 50% in tax if you take into account all tax, including consumption taxes. And it is a bit progressive up to quite wealthy people. But the super rich, it goes backwards and they pay 25% in tax. Surely we have to agree something's gone wrong there. Even if you're a radical libertarian who thinks we shouldn't have taxation or something, while we've got taxation, surely there's something wrong that the super rich, the billionaires, are paying half as much tax as the rest of us. I kind of just want to press that for the moment, and it's not involving my own philosophical work, but it seems a point surely we can get some consensus around. And Gabriel Zucman, you've got all sorts of worries. Can we really do this? Will they flee to another country? Check out his proposals for doing that. It was his book, actually, that was keeping me awake last night. All right, my wife's going to drumming class because it's Thursday night. So I'm going to sign off. Thanks for your support. Subscribe. See you soon.